Right. Good evening, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us. We'll take a few moments, just allow other folks to gather. So if there's anything you need to do right now, please just take your time. We'll get started soon. All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. I am Dr. Susan Wilhoit, one of the National Medical Directors for Compassion and Choices. Tonight, I have the joy and the honor to visit with Dr. Martha Calihan, who wrote the book, A Living Death. In this book, Martha shares the story of her husband's final illness and his death. And she's using this book to address some of the big questions about end-of-life care and about the dying process. Dr. Calihan offers a really unique perspective, both as a wife and as a physician, which really allows her to explore these end-of-life issues on such a personal and professional level. She also weaves some of the mystical aspects of death and dying as a part of what she witnessed alongside her husband's journey. And Dr. Calihan, thank you so much for joining us tonight, and I look forward to visiting with you.
Thank you. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here. Appreciate the opportunity.
Yes. Before we get started, just some reminders for the webinar. We're going to ask that everyone is muted, and please turn off your video. We do have a question and answer box. So as questions arise throughout our time together, please go ahead and jot those down into the question box so that we can take some time at the end to really dedicate to explore those questions with you and with Dr. Calihan. Also, we want to give everyone the heads up that this is being recorded. First, about Compassion and Choices. We are the country's largest nonprofit organization committed to improving care, expanding choices, and empowering everyone to chart their own end-of-life journey. And as a part of Compassion and Choices, we try to provide end-of-life planning resources. We have a dementia-specific planning tool. We advocate for legislation to authorize medical aid in dying. And we also work to address end-of-life disparities so that everyone has access to the care and the comfort they deserve. As a part of Compassion and Choices, Doctors for Dignity is a community of physicians from across the country. It's actually the group that brought us here tonight. We are trying to advocate for a full range of end-of-life options, including medical aid in dying, as well as reducing end-of-life disparities. If you have any more interest in Doctors for Dignity, please reach out to us. So Dr. Calihan. Dr. Calihan is a board certified in integrative and holistic medicine, as well as family medicine. She's a certified functional medicine physician, and she brings decades of experience to her work with patients with whom she helps to achieve their optimal health and wellness through a variety of techniques. She's a graduate of Smith College. She obtained her medical degree from Georgetown University Medical School. And in addition to her training at the Center for Mind-Body Medicine in Washington, D.C., she also trained in acupuncture with Dr. Joseph Helms at the David Geffen School of Medicine. She was a member of the first class of certified functional medicine physicians through the Institute of Functional Medicine. Dr. Calihan specializes in the treatment of chronic complex conditions, including autoimmune disease, thyroid and hormonal imbalances, biotoxin illness, chronic fatigue, and fibromyalgia. Using that functional medicine approach, she searches for causes of a condition and then helps to rework and rebalance the system. Dr. Calihan wrote the book, A Death Lived, and it's available from her own website at Five Stones Wellness and Healing Center. You can also find it on Amazon, on Barnes & Noble, Goodreads, and at some other local sellers. I'm excited tonight to sit down with Dr. Calihan together and to explore the book that she spent a lot of time and energy and love in creating so that all of us can learn from her husband and learn from her. And Dr. Calihan, thank you so much for your time tonight.
Thank you, Susan. It's really
Yeah,
an honor to be here. I'm happy to have this conversation with you.
such an important conversation, and you have such a great perspective.
It is a really important conversation. And if there's one thing that I
Yeah.
really feel passionate about, having had this experience, it's in the importance of having the conversations around end of life care and death and dying that is just crucial.
Yes. And looking at our audience tonight, how would you even recommend going about that? How do people
About
start?
having the conversation.
Yeah.
So it's hard. I mean, ours is a very death phobic culture, in my opinion.
Mhm.
Um, we're just, death is not in our culture a part of life. That may
Mm,
sound funny, but in other cultures, and certainly in times before us, before our time, I think death was much more a natural part of life, and people saw it, experienced it. And so it probably wasn't quite so foreign and maybe not quite so frightening to people. But
sure.
our culture is very death phobic, and it's hard to broach the conversation.
Mm,
So what I advise people to do is to just start by having a conversation. And sometimes it's easier if you're trying to, let's say, work with a parent or an elderly person and you're not sure if they're going to be receptive to the conversation, maybe
mm,
start with yourself. You
yeah.
know, I'm thinking about this for myself and how I want to think about my end of life. And maybe that opens the door for someone to join that conversation. But that's
Mhm.
a way that I have found can be helpful.
Yeah. It sounds like just even being able to be vulnerable with yourself and sharing that vulnerability with others maybe gives them the courage and power to share their wishes with you.
Exactly. Yeah.
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 And I'm curious, especially with your experience, both as wife and physician, or what can we learn about as physicians specifically? What can we do to minimize this death phobia and this kind of death adverse culture? Or what role do we have in that for the
I think
society?
we have a huge role. And when I was in training,
Mhm.
we didn't learn much, if anything,
Mhm.
about end of life and death. Um, we weren't really taught how to deal with it, how to address it, either with our patients or ourselves.
Sure.
I know I recount an anecdote in the book. I can't remember now if I was a student or I must have been an intern, and
Mhm.
having to, declare somebody dead
Yeah.
because that was the law that a physician had to do that. And it's like, what do you do? Uh,
Mhm.
yeah, but there was not a process to then sort of deal with that. And I think I really believe that in medical training, we've been taught to save and continue life at all costs,
Mhm.
and that death is a failure.
Mhm.
And I think that is fundamentally flawed thinking. And it also depends on where you are on the spectrum, right? Because obviously, physicians save lives and do heroic and wonderful things all the time.
Mhm.
And many wonderful and heroic things were done for my Charles during
Mhm.
the process.
Mhm.
But there comes a time where it's bigger than we are, right?
Mhm.
And it's not, I don't see it as the failure of medicine.
Yeah. And something I really valued in the book was how you really did honor and appreciate and reflect on these amazing medical advances from which Charles benefited, but also being able to say, yes, those served him well at a certain time. And maybe now we're looking at something else. And maybe we need to shift away from that. So I really value that you appreciated and uplifted the amazingness of medical science, but we're also able to kind of say, hey, let's take a step back here and really evaluate what we're doing to this person as a whole.
Right. And I think that's what we lose track of so often in a situation where this was a chronic illness situation with sort of episodes of crises.
Mhm.
And in the last year of Charles's life, I think he had 6 ICU admissions.
Yeah.
Now, you and I would both know, looking at that objectively, like that's not a recipe for a good outcome. But when you're in it,
Mhm.
you you lose the perspective because you're in it. You're in crisis mode. You're in survival mode,
Mhm.
day to day, moment to moment. And it's really hard to step back and have that bigger picture. in the moment of the crisis.
Yes.
Which brings me back to the importance of having had those conversations.
Yes.
You know, all the conversations that Charles and I had, I knew what he wanted,
Mhm.
or I thought I did at least.
Mhm.
But it wasn't like opening a whole brand new conversation
Mhm.
as time went on and those repetitions went on. And yes, he had wonderful things, wonderful interventions to save his life over and over again.
Mhm.
And then got to the point and the time where it was just like enough.
Yes.
It's not going to change.
Yeah.
Maybe he could have done one more, two more of those rounds of intervention, but it was just too much for a body.
Mhm. And
Mhm.
it seemed too, like with every intervention or every episode of crisis, that he didn't ever rebound back to where he was prior to that episode.
No,
Yeah.
I used to picture it like a stairway, you know,
Yeah.
and then he'd stabilize, and then there was another little hit,
Mhm.
and it felt to me as if he was just it was chipping away at him,
Yeah. And I
and
love,
he never got back to the prior level on each of the occasions.
mhm. And it sounded like he understood that, but it sounded too that he accepted where he was and still was able to just keep his focus on his wishes, which I think can be really hard for patients.
It was remarkable to witness, and that's really why the book is titled A Death Lived, because Charles lived his death.
Yes.
There was no doubt about where he was headed. He knew it. We knew it. We talked about it all the time.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't mean that he didn't hope that it wouldn't happen right away or soon or perhaps even ever,
Yeah,
but he knew it would. So
sure.
holding both of those pieces, and he was very, very clear, as you know from reading the book, about what he did and didn't want
Yes.
done.
And I think that's such a gift that Charles was able to give you, give his sons, give his physicians, his care team. And I, in my experience, sometimes I may have a patient that is clear and is able to articulate it, but it does feel, and I think it goes back to what you were sharing earlier about our kind of our death phobic culture. I feel like so many folks I see with repeat admissions and ICU and complications are still so hesitant to go there, to have that talk. Um, and maybe even kind of setting aside the physician role for a second, as a wife, as a partner, what did you learn in the process of what it was to give voice to your loved one's wishes?
I mean, in many ways, it was the hardest thing I ever had to do in my life, but I loved him enough to do it.
Yeah.
Um, it was, and I can't pretend that I didn't have the perspective of being a physician. My left brain, if you will,
Mhm.
knew where this was likely to end up. My heart didn't want that,
Sure.
but I knew what was important to Charles, and it was quality.
Mhm.
It was our time that we had. We loved our time at home, and we would talk and talk about the fact that he was dying.
Mhm.
And then we'd be looking at a seed catalog to see what seeds to plant. I mean, that's the back and forth and
Yeah.
the dualistic nature of what we were dealing with, but also an example, I think, of how the fact that he was dying wove into our everyday lives such that it was just part of the conversation and part of our reality, and not this I'm afraid to talk about it
Mhm.
thing every
Mhm.
time we talked about it.
Yeah. And I remember too that you shared just this profound relief, and almost this freedom, I think was a word that you used after having had, the real discussion with your palliative care colleague, Tom, I think was his
Mhm.
name.
Yeah.
Um, and so I wonder if you could just, for the audience, speak a little bit to that sense of freedom and that relief just by even having that conversation, sharing that with Charles.
It's like, before that, it's a little bit like having an elephant in the room that
Mhm.
you're, you should talk about it. And Charles and I had talked about it, but it was sort of the validation that this was the place we were in. And I remember we were probably about halfway through the year of these repeated admissions. And Charles and I had started talking about, where's this going? What do we do? Is it time for palliative care?
Mm-hmm.
And Tom was a friend and a colleague.
Mm-hmm.
So I called him, and it took a day or two for us to, connect on the phone. And I pretended, I like presented a case to him, and said, well, here's the situation, and told him about it and said, what do you think would be the timing? When is it appropriate to start thinking about palliative care? And when I heard him say now, I mean, I remember my heart absolutely sank. And I knew that's what he was going to say. But it also was like, oh, and he knew perfectly well that I was talking about Charles. And then very soon after that, he came to the house, and we had a formal conversation where the three of us sat and talked and had that conversation. And having that external authority expert person sort of validate where we were in the process, not that he could prognosticate and say, you have this much time or that much time, but yes, this is a situation that is likely to continue to decline, and here are your options. And it was very freeing because it's like it had been spoken.
Yeah. Just the fact, I remember at one point it sounded as though after the conversation had been had, there was even, I think it was actually Charles that added some levity.
Usually,
To say, well, we all know I'm dying. This is all going to happen. But it sounded as though, I felt as a reader a sense of relief, because it sounded as though maybe Connor was there, your son. It's my
no worries.
Apologize to everyone. The other thing that I thought was very interesting, that it felt like it came up maybe midway through the complications of that year, and that is coming up against other physicians who maybe felt that Charles should keep pushing and keep going and keep doing. And I'm wondering for you, again, you holding that space of both wife and physician, how do you, I guess, in both roles, say, no, we don't want this? Or can you speak to that a bit?
Yeah, and you're right, we did. There was a point in time where his heart stopped for a matter of seconds. And the proposed solution was to have him have a pacemaker, which in and of itself is not a terribly difficult or challenging procedure to have done. But it was 6 ICU hospitalizations in, it was 6 major procedures in. And we had the conversation about, yeah, he could do the pacemaker, and then he wouldn't have that cardiac pause again, presumably. But where were we heading? And I remember sort of having the thought of like, that's actually not a bad way out, right? If his heart just stops. And then thinking, how can I think that about the man I love? Mm-hmm. But it seemed like an odd thing to take off the table as he was getting more and more clear about the fact that he was done with intervention. And very shortly after that, he decided to not do the pacemaker, to come home. And that's when we formally moved into hospice care. But his medical care team was actually quite taken back by that decision. It's like, well, this is so easy. It's such an easy solution. And the conversation was, yeah, but where in the, yeah, you can fix his heart rhythm today, but let's look at the whole man.
Yeah.
What's the experience? Where is this headed? What's, and what does he want?
Right.
And it took real pushing to have people other than Tom talk to him about that. And as physicians, we're trained to do things, right? There are interventions. There always, or almost always, things to do. That's what we do. That's how we're trained. That's what we're good at. And I talk about, you get on this medical moving sidewalk, and sometimes it's hard to get off of that thing.
Yes.
But that is what this is about when you can decide that it's time to get off that medical sidewalk.
Mhm.
That's not always the right decision for everybody. For us, it was. For Charles, it was. But the
Mhm.
whole point of this conversation and what we're talking about is the importance of having that conversation with your people, your loved ones, whomever, to have clarity about what, I guess it's really what their values are, what's important to them. For Charles, it was quality of life. He
Mhm.
was done with being in the hospital. He knew he could have a few more procedures.
Mhm.
He wanted that time at home.
Yeah.
So if we hadn't had that conversation into the ground for months and months and months,
Mhm.
I suspect he would have had the pacemaker because there wouldn't have been the pause to, I just had this thought and I hadn't had it before, but currently, before they do any surgery now, there's a pause in the operating room, a timeout. And that was designed to make sure that the patient's name was correct, the procedure was correct, which, right or left, so that everybody was on the same team. It was a safety initiative that is now just part of the culture. And it's almost as if that's what we need, right? A pause. Okay, stop. Here are the options, and here's where it's likely to end up, either with it or without it.
Yeah, I love that idea of the pause and
Yeah.
really allowing for that space. Um, and I think everyone, I'm going to apologize and go let my dog outside. I will be right.
No worries. So for us, I'll just keep going, but Charles had been so clear about what he did and didn't want that it made speaking those decisions and standing in that space when the time came and the challenge came, it made it easier because he had been so clear, or I should say it made it less hard, maybe not easy, less hard, because he had been so clear all along the way.
Mhm.
He was a very opinionated man, so but it was a tremendous gift that he gave us as a family, that he was that clear and we knew what he wanted done and not done.
In looking at the physicians who maybe have their own discomfort with death or dying, or maybe there's even physicians on the call that maybe in some cases do feel like death is a failure, and sometimes maybe it is. How can we, as a medical community, really try to confront death as a reality and support our patients in that moving sidewalk and counseling them, ushering them as to say, when is it time to get off the sidewalk? When is it time to keep going?
I think it's more than the physician. I think the culture as a whole, if we were all talking more about death and just as a part of life, something that we knew was, coming and part of the experience, or admitting that it was coming, it would, we could all be more easeful in talking about it.
Mhm.
And I think as physicians, we ought to remember periodically to ask people, what, and ahead of time, right? So there's physicians in the hospital who get to deal with the crisis, and that's a hard time to start those conversations. But all of us who see patients in an office setting where, it's less intense and
Mhm.
there's a little more time, I think those conversations should be just part of a normal conversation.
Yes, I agree. And I think the more we normalize them and make them less taboo, and I love what you said about focusing on what someone's values are, where someone finds joy,
Yeah,
because that's the root of it. And then we can add the layers of medical complexity.
right.
Um, but I do think that by focusing on who are you as a person, what do you value, where do you find joy? For me, that's a way of being able to shape the conversation about the bigger picture versus on, do you want a pacemaker or not?
Right.
I think that I worry sometimes in medicine that, as to what you said earlier, we keep doing and doing and doing, but just because we can doesn't mean it's the right thing.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that awareness is just something that we need to remember all the time in
Mhm.
in all the interventions. And
Mhm.
it's much more clear when someone is at the end of a really chronic complex illness and or very advanced age. And obviously it's all different. If you have an accident or are brought to the emergency room, yeah, you probably want everything done. And that, so it's not, it's not always the same conversation. But again, even somebody with a horrendous injury or accident, understanding their values may inform those decisions too, right? Down over time. I mean, not maybe not a moment of the crisis.
Sure.
Yeah.
What do you think, if you had a magic wand and could, use it over medical education, whether medical school or residency, what would you do with that wand?
Well, and I have to first say that I was in medical school a long time ago. So I hope that the training is different. I don't know that. I haven't set foot in a medical school in a while. But I would really want acknowledgement of the death and dying process and that the need to have that conversation and to support people and just to really support medical students and house staff in processing their emotions when they lose a patient. We've all lost plenty of patients over time. And I remember the sense in training of there wasn't even time to let myself think about it because your pager was going off and the next crisis was there. So it was just get it done. And I think it was you who was saying the what we were all taught about keeping people alive just till the next shift.
Yeah. Pass the pager.
And why was that? Because it made it easier for us, right?
Yeah. And that compartmentalization that you talk about in the book too, and the need to compartmentalize in training, particularly when you are kind of putting out multiple fires and you're overwhelmed by the situation. I think as a survival technique, we learn that and it can become such a part of our practice. But again, that's a good, I think, opportunity to use that pause and maybe bring that back into our everyday practice of saying, I'm feeling something here. I'm feeling like this patient's not doing well. I wonder what the family's feeling. I wonder what the patient's feeling. I
spoke to in the book, I really struggled with that throughout Charles's illnesses because candidly, it was a lot easier for me to sit in the ICU, look at the monitors, look at him using medical eyes. Yeah. You don't have to really open your heart.
Sure.
But I was his wife. And when I sat there as a wife and let myself feel those emotions and deal with that, I know it was much healthier for me and for us as a couple and a family.
Yes.
But it sure was tempting sometimes to just look at the numbers, assess the situation, and move on.
Yeah. And something I really thought was beautiful in one of those terrible crises in the ICU, you actually spoke to what it was to actually be able to be a wife, and partly because your dear physician colleague friends were in the room and they were the ones able to, it sounded as though, or felt as though as a reader, that you were kind of able to say indirectly, okay, you hold this medical piece. I just need to be a wife right now. And you were given, in a way, like their presence gave you permission to sink into that wife role that I think was so valuable for all of you.
Absolutely it was. That's when he was basically bleeding. I mean, it wasn't a full code, but it was close to a full code. And so the whole team was there with the crash cart and they just let me be.
Yeah.
I'm sure they wanted me to be wife and not be doctor at all. Just get out of it.
Yep. Something I do in my practice, I talk with folks a lot about, their wishes, advanced care planning, understanding their joys, their values. And something I appreciate about that is being able to participate in the patient's or the family's understanding of their medical complexity. Because I feel like a lot of times when we generically say, oh, here, fill out this form or check this box, or do you want everything done? We're not giving our patients the full picture. And so what can we do better as physicians in facilitating those conversations, that meaningful advanced care planning, 5 wishes, most form, any of those kind of conversations, what can we do for our patients and their families to help them really understand what these choices are and how it applies to their own context?
It's ghoulish, but I think vivid description of what these procedures are can be very helpful. Some people are squeamish and don't want to hear it, but you need to hear it. You know, it's very easy to say, sure, I want everything done because it sounds easy. You know, do you want a feeding tube? Well, sure. Why wouldn't I? I don't want to starve. Well, do you realize what that entails? And describing that. The answer may be yes, and that's fine. But a lot of people who understand what that whole piece looks like, no, thank you. I'm okay without that. And I think we gloss it over. We sort of present it in a sanitized version that isn't really real. And I would say that's not really fair.
It's a form, for me, it's informed consent issue. And we give our patients, you know, the risks and benefits of everything else we propose to them. But I don't think, generally speaking, we do a great job of it with these pieces.
Yeah, I mean, something as simple or common as CPR. Yes, it can save a life, but it's a pretty brutal thing to witness, or certainly to have done on you. And I think people would think twice about saying, oh yeah, please do everything, if they understood really what those things are.
It sounded like throughout the book, you all were having, you and Charles particularly, were having conversations about his wishes, but then it seemed as though they kind of would build upon each other, the conversations. And then you did really sit down with Tom and really formalize and document everything. And I'm just curious, you know, with your own practice with your patients, but also what we can learn as the audience of how can we facilitate like the stepping stones of these conversations, knowing that the conversation isn't a one and done. It's an evolving dialogue.
Absolutely. And it builds, just like you said, it builds on itself. I mean, we had so many conversations. We had the gift of time to have all those conversations.
Sure.
And then once Charles was much more clear about what some of the options were and what he did and didn't want, I mean, he sat us down as a family and was very clear on, you know, what he did and didn't want. And that's when he said, you know, okay, we all know I'm dying. I hope it's not soon. And this is what I want, and this is what I don't want. And don't ever use the phrase that I passed, I'm going to die. That was very important to him. So with that repetitive nature of the conversations, I think helping people know that there are tools out there that can help form those conversations, or at least start those conversations, is a great thing. I mean, we used that 5 wishes tool, which found a little squishy. You know, we got to the point about, do you want your feet rubbed with oil? He was like, enough. You know, enough. For that day, anyway. But if you are actually answering questions like that, it can really help your own clarity about, that sounds good, that sounds awful, take that one away, you know, I'll do that. And it's likely to change over time, but at least you've started to have those conversations.
Yes. With, you know, we have like 200, you know, physicians and folks on the call right now. What do you think Charles, the teacher that he is, a lifelong teacher, what do you think he would want for all of us to hear as learners?
I think what he would want most is for people to be able to voice the fact that they're dying, that it's going to happen, to step into that space of being able to be with that reality, and to speak, to have the conversations, to help the person and the family deal with it. I think his single most strongest message would be, start talking.
Yeah. It sounded as though for you, your faith was a part of this experience, kind of weaved throughout in some way. And then for Charles too, some version of that also seemed true for him, particularly closer towards the end. And it seemed as though, and this is my own perception, but it seemed as though for both of you, that sense of faith was a sense of comfort, a source of comfort. What do you say to folks that maybe their sense of faith compels them to think that maybe God will fix everything and God will save everything, and therefore they resist those conversations? They resist talking about the what ifs and the difficult conversations, and instead put that faith in God. I don't know if this has happened to you, but I've come across this quite a
great
bit.
question. Yeah. But I think I think everybody deep down inside knows at some point they're going to die.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that situation will be fixed by God.
Mm-hmm.
But at some point they're going to die.
Mm-hmm.
And even if they don't want to admit that right now, I think it could be a hypothetical, like, well, what if this doesn't work? And how can we make this easier for your spouse?
Yes.
Or your child?
Yeah.
So I think we can deal in hypotheticals when a cold, hard reality might be too hard.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I like to use oftentimes this wish worry statement. So, I mean, I wish that something miraculous could happen and really fix all of this. But I really worry that what we're seeing, this isn't going to end well. And really trying to acknowledge or validate that hope. That's something that I struggle with too, with folks sometimes.
Charles had much the same thing. And I wrote about that too. I think that's another theme that is woven into medical training is this fear of don't take away hope.
Mm-hmm.
Maintain hope no matter what, because that's important.
Mm-hmm.
And I agree that hope is important. They can both be held, right? The reality of what's happening and hope that something different might happen, or it might be longer or delayed or whatever. I don't think that being truthful and hope are can't be in the same space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think too, going back to that sense of freedom and that relief that you expressed after having had really the conversation and really, it sounded like feeling very clear about what Charles would and would not want. That it sounded as though that what people generally, what we're trained to do is to avoid and to resist and to not try to give someone the fear of their actual prognosis. Like we would be somehow, by telling them the honesty of our best prognosis, we are instilling fear in them. But instead it sounded as though that there is almost like a little less fear for you all once you were able to speak so clearly and honestly.
And certainly as a physician, I've had that experience where you've got somebody really ill in the hospital bed and the spouse may be in the hall, and the person in the bed is saying, don't tell my spouse I'm dying. And the person in the hall is saying, don't tell my spouse he's dying. And it's like through my eyes, such a missed opportunity. You know, people generally know. It's just a question of, can you give voice to that? So that's our job, right? To support people in being able to give voice to that. Say it. Maybe saying it will be a tremendous relief like it was for us.
Yes.
Yeah. It was less scary spoken than worried about.
Yes. And named.
Yeah, name it. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was kind of like the elephant in the room.
Right. Going back to kind of talking with Tom, and it sounded as though kind of your internal sense was, yeah, it's time to have these palliative care conversations. But being able to hear it from Tom, from the palliative medicine physician, it was something, it sounded as though in your own intuition, you knew, but to hear this other person validate it seemed to be more affirming than fearful.
Right. Because there are 1,000 ways I could have talked myself out of admitting that, right? Sure. I was tired. I was worried, you know, that. And I knew, and Charles knew.
Sure.
So having that mirrored back to us was really helpful. And, you know, it's not as if Charles didn't sign those DNR papers that day. It took weeks to months.
Right.
But process.
It's the process.
It's a process.
Yes.
Yeah.
Let's see. We have about 15 minutes left, and we have 13 questions.
All right.
I'm going to move to the question bank. I have some more too, but I want to give the audience some time.
Sure.
All right. So this is from Faith. Would you repeat how to learn about? Sorry, this is I can share that with you, Faith. Doctors with Dignity. If you even just Google compassion and choices and Doctors with Dignity, then you'll be able to get to our link. And then I can also just post on this thread the website, and I'll do that at the end. And then I think it's Joanna was asking if you could speak to how an end-of-life doula could also support this situation.
Yeah, I love the concept of end-of-life doulas. We did not have one. I've certainly worked with birth doulas over the years with families and patients. But again, that's another person who's there to help support the patient, the family. I see the death doula as somebody who's standing in that space again, not afraid to confront the reality and to help with whatever it is that needs to be done, whether that's physical, emotional, psychosocial, all those things.
Yes.
Just one more person on the team to help. I love that concept.
Yes, extra layer of support. I'm all for that. Thank you for that question. And Dawn is asking, what did you find that you didn't expect, given your experience in death and dying, and now being a spousal caregiver?
That I didn't expect. I think probably the degree of difficulty, how hard it was to do. Yeah, I would say that it was certainly probably a harder process than I had thought I understood when I witnessed other people do it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And Kimberly's asking, she first comments that your book was eye-opening. And one of the things that struck Kimberly was the fortunate position you had because you knew so many of Charles's doctors. And even with that, some of the doctors were uncomfortable. We spoke to that with your and Charles's position to stop treatment. And so can you talk a little bit more about the difficulty of having doctors having to kind of almost fight with doctors that disagree with the stopping of that sidewalk of medicine?
I would say overall, it was a tremendous benefit and a gift that many of these people were our friends, certainly my colleagues, and we've known them for years. It was a small town, small medical community, so we did all know each other pretty well. Certainly that was a tremendous benefit. It was hard too, to challenge. It was hard for me to feel as if I was challenging what colleagues were recommending, suggesting. A little less hard for Charles because it was one removed. But for me, it was hard. But my decisions were obviously to be the wife and to back him and his choices.
Yes. And then Kimberly's also asking, kind of along those lines, as someone without necessarily a lot of friends who are physicians, what can folks who don't have a lot of physician friends do to get the answers they need and to have the conversations that are necessary when the time comes?
Just keep asking. I mean, I think any of us as physicians need to be willing and able to have those conversations when our patients and family members ask. Now in hospitals too, there are additional resources. You can always ask for a palliative care consultation. You can ask for social work help. There are things, and sadly, I guess, we really have to advocate for ourselves and our families. But that is part of the reality, and I wouldn't back down.
Yeah. And I would absolutely echo that in the hospital setting, particularly because it is more easy. It's not necessarily easy, but it's easier to access a palliative care consult in a hospital setting than it is as an outpatient. So Kimberly, yes, I think keep asking, advocating for yourself and your loved ones, getting palliative care involved, even just to
have that right to ask for that consultation anytime.
Yeah.
And even if you get pushback, if you want, at least ask for the consultation, have the conversation. Wouldn't it be wonderful if they said, probably best if you wait another 2 years before we have this conversation.
Yeah.
Not likely to happen, but
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah, and what I would say is oftentimes what I hear from patients I'm a palliative medicine specialist, and as I hear from patients and families that, oh, we were asking for this for so long, but my doctor kept saying we weren't ready, that we weren't there yet. And my hope is that folks do feel empowered to keep advocating, to keep voicing it, because if, in my experience, if the patient or the family is sensing that it's time to have these conversations, it's time. And that sometimes the doctors are the last to realize that it had been time to have those conversations.
Right. That goes
Yeah.
right back to, it's not just the thing, the intervention, the procedure, the whatever, the new medicine, right? It's the entirety of the person, the family, the experience.
Mm-hmm.
And I was taught palliative care, and maybe this is the wrong statistic, but you know, if you're in your last, if you're probably within your last couple of years of life, that's a good time to start engaging a palliative care consultation.
Mm-hmm.
Because
Mm-hmm.
it's all about supporting you and caring for you in the most supportive environment possible, whether that's at home or in a hospital or
And having the conversation, which in the primary care setting, oftentimes there isn't time. In the more traditional model of medicine,
right.
there isn't time to have these conversations. And that's one of the values or the benefits of a palliative medicine team or specialist, is that there is time. I think
And
that's
people have such understandably such wrong ideas about what even hospice means.
Sure.
Because people think that, you know, if you go into hospice care, that means you're not going to get any kind of treatment at all. And that's just not true.
Yeah. And I love with, yeah, it sounds
And
like,
uh, such a shame that patients and families don't get that support. It's just so often we hear people, you know, they got hospice involved and a week later, within a week, the person was dead. That hasn't done much for anybody.
yeah. I love that Charles, after he was enrolled in hospice, would still go to your office and still do his work and still do the things that he was enjoying doing. I think at one point he even actually drove out to the store to get some, but just kind of kind of addressing that myth that, oh, once you're in hospice, you're bed bound, but really knowing that it's meant to enhance your quality of life and your comfort for whatever time remains. And I feel like Charles, again, the teacher that he is, really demonstrated that and taught us that. So
he lived it. He wasn't get in the car and go get peanuts, but
yes, peanuts. That's what it was. Yes. Kimberly is commenting that her mom had Parkinson's and shared that no doctors could talk about what the end would look like. And she found this information to also be lacking within the various Parkinson's organizations. It sounded as though, from Kimberly's perspective, that everyone wanted to be positive and avoided talking about death and what the end would look like. And she's just commenting that as a caregiver, especially at home with her mom, how important it is for the caregivers to really know what to expect, what to look for. And Kimberly, thank you for sharing. Thank you so much for caregiving for your mother. And I'll pass it on to Martha.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, again, I would say it's probably in the last 50, certainly 100 years, where death in our culture has become so institutionalized that many of us have not witnessed a death. Mm-hmm. So we don't know what that looks like at home, what the sort of gradual decline is for many of us or most of us, what signs to look for, and sort of know what different things are suggesting along the way. And then in any given illness, like Kimberly's talking about, you know, I think somebody could sit down and tell you, you know, there are various ways that we see this end. It's not saying what's going to happen. You're not being held to that, but these are the kinds of things, whether it's respiratory or cardiac. And again, if you can speak it, I think it becomes less frightening.
Yes. Yes.
What does a respiratory death look like? I mean, it's a horrible thing to think about if you don't know what help can be brought to bear with that. And, you know, have the conversations.
Yes. I want to go there. More and more questions. These are wonderful. Let's see. someone is asking specifically if Charles's death was natural or was he assisted in any way?
It was natural.
Mhm.
It was, we don't have any
Mhm.
assist death in Virginia.
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
interesting. I've thought many times about, I wonder what he would have done.
Mm.
You know, that's hard to second guess for someone.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
I think he probably would have liked to have the option and probably would not have used it. Just the way things unfolded. That's
Yes.
not a judgment call. It's just the way things
Yeah.
unfold.
Yeah. And Sue is asking if Alzheimer's is considered a terminal illness, and would this diagnosis be considered for medical aid in dying? And I'm happy to take that one. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, it's certainly end-stage dementia is absolutely a terminal illness when someone has reached the end stage of their dementia process, including Alzheimer's. And the way that the laws are written for medical aid in dying is that you have to be able to demonstrate, the patient has to be able to demonstrate capacity to be able to make complex medical decisions. And unfortunately, as a result of end-stage dementia, the patient's not able to demonstrate the capacity to be able to make that request independently. And so unfortunately, throughout the United States, dementia is not, you're not allowed to use a dementia diagnosis or anyone for whatever diagnosis without being able to verify that the patient is making a decision and making a choice with full capacity to make decisions on their own. So I hope that answers your question, but no, unfortunately, dementia is not allowed with medical aid in dying. Let's see. And so Patricia is asking if you can talk a little bit about your personal feeling about what happens after death.
Again, and as I shared in the book, much to my surprise,
Mm-hmm.
the enormous gift that I was given when Charles died, and I was lying in the bed with him, and he had died, and others of us were in and out of the room. But at this particular moment, I was alone with him, and I witnessed his spirit leave, physically leave his body, in a way that there was absolutely no doubt in my mind of what had happened.
Yes.
And I would say that my conviction around that is because of the total and complete sense of peace that came over me when that happened. Because, you know, my left brain was like, what the heck was that? I didn't learn about that. There was the sort of objective, maybe scientific part. It was like, let it go.
Yeah.
Just be in this moment. Realize the gift you were just given.
Wow.
And that sense of peace that came over me. So for me, I have absolutely no doubt that the spirit goes on and continues. Where, how, I don't know. But that was the other tremendous gift that he gave me.
How beautiful. Yes. And I think if it's okay, we'll end on that note. And I thank you so much for writing this book, for sharing Charles's story, for allowing us to learn from him. He absolutely is a teacher. It's very clear that he's teaching you still, and I think honestly teaching all of us on this call. Thank you for the energy and the love and the time you spent sharing his story.
Thank you, Susan. It was an honor and a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. And I wanted to share too, in the question and the Q&A box, there were some great recommendations for some resources around advanced care planning specifically, including the Conversation Project, which is a great resource, as well as Ariadne Labs, also wonderful resources for facilitating the conversation, but also for patient-facing documents that patients can use to really try to outline what they want and really do it in a way that's full of focusing on their values and on their joys, kind of what we talked about tonight. At Compassion and Choices, we do have our own end-of-life care planning guides, which I would highly recommend to everyone at any stage in life to start looking at, start thinking about, and most importantly, start sharing with your family. So if you're interested in any of these resources, please, we have our website here. Please feel free to reach out. A lot of these are digital actually, so you can actually go through them right there on your laptop or on your computer, discuss them live with your family, or if you prefer just to take some time with yourself and explore them, that's absolutely something I would encourage you to do right now. I also wanted to share that the book A Death Lived can be purchased directly from the Five Stones Wellness website, which is Dr. Calihan's website. You can also find it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and Goodreads. And lastly, I want to thank everyone tonight for their time, for their energy, and for making Compassion and Choices what it is. I'm proud to be a part of this organization, and we could not do it without the donations and the generosity of our supporters. And if anything tonight moved you to donate and to share with us, please know that we honor your gift, we respect your contribution, and we are very grateful for you allowing us to do what we do. With that, I'll say thank you all. Thank you very much, Dr. Calihan, and good night. Thank you.
Right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Mhm.